In life, we encounter people every day, all of whom have stories to share. We rarely take the time to ask people their personal stories, many of which will touch, move, and inspire us in some way. Matt has a passion for making authentic connections and learning about people from all walks of life. He has lived a life of giving back to the community and making a difference in people's lives. Are you ready to meet fascinating people and hear some inspiring stories? The Matt Hilton Show will introduce you to a world of possibilities you never knew existed. Sit back, be present, and enjoy. Here's your host, Matt Hilton.
Hey everyone, Matt Hilton here, host of the Matt Hilton Show. Thank you for tuning in. Today's guest is a great friend of mine. She's a past speech and debate coach. She's an executive director of a local nonprofit, and she's an acclaimed author. You don't want to miss this episode. Stay tuned for a word from our sponsor.
Inspired, experienced, customer-focused. Find a mortgage that fits your needs with Maria Leach at First United Bank Mortgage, specializing in construction and closing all types of loans, including jumbo, portfolio, conventional, FHA, and VA. A tenured team, outstanding service, competitive programs. Finance your dreams with Maria Leach at First United Bank Mortgage. mleach.firstunitedteam.com, 214-316-7915. mleach at firstunitedbank.com. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Matt Hilton Show today. Today's guest is a very special friend of mine who I met several years ago, and she has just been an inspiration to me, and I find her to be a very fascinating person. And I wanted her to come on the show and tell her your story, share her story with you today. So today's guest is Sally Gary. And Sally, thank you so much for being here today.
You bet.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. This is
most definitely.
This is fun.
It is. It's going to be fun. And we're going to do a little bit of a different format today, as you and I have discussed. This isn't necessarily going to be an interview with Sally. It's going to be a dialogue between the two of us. So she will be asking me questions. I'll be asking her questions. And it's just going to be a very interesting show. So I'm excited about this. So this will be 2 parts. So we will air one part, and then the following week will be part 2. So I'm excited about that and look forward to our conversation.
I do too.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about you and where you grew up and a little bit about your background. I mean, I know that's a loaded question, but...
Well, it is, and I'm assuming that we need the the expanded time because I'm old, and so there's a lot to tell. There's a lot of background.
That's
there.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Oh goodness, I grew up in the '60s and '70s in Wichita Falls, Texas, just a little bit north of here, and used to come to Dallas, Fort Worth, of course, to go to Six Flags in the summers as a kid, and came down to go shopping at North Park Mall.
Mm-hmm.
So I had a little bit of knowledge as a kid growing up, and it was always, my dream as a kid to live in Dallas. I didn't really take that path once I got out on my own, but I ended up here, and that's a really sweet part of the story that I'll share later if you want to hear that too. But I went to Ryder High School in Wichita Falls and graduated in 1979. There you can do the math. And it was in many ways a very idyllic childhood. My mom and dad were good, stalwart Christian family, grew up going to church. My mom was a school teacher. My dad was an accountant, civil servant, worked at Shepherd Air Force Base back in the day. And so lots of really sweet things about that time in my life.
So what is one of your most favorite memories of your childhood? If you could pinpoint one, what is your most favorite memory?
Probably memories with my grandparents who lived in Archer City, Texas, just a little bit south of Wichita Falls, home of Larry McMurtry, author of Lonesome Dove and The Last Picture Show. And so I grew up spending weekends down there. I remember one of the fondest memories, my grandparents bringing a little puppy to me when I was about 3 years old. It's a snapshot memory. I remember him getting out of the car, this little red dachshund puppy that we named Fritz, and had a little rope around its neck. And I just thought he was the greatest thing. He was not nearly as enamored with me as I was with him, but those are some really sweet memories for me.
Yeah. And I'm right there with you. I mean, some of my most fondest memories were with my grandparents. So yeah, it's a precious time to be a grandparent, right? And
It really is.
yeah. So one of my brothers, I'm the oldest of four, and one of my brothers just became a grandfather.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So he became a grandfather before I did, and
Yeah.
so it's interesting to see, that whole process and what he's going through as far as being called, pops and all that. So it's interesting.
Well,
Yeah.
maybe someday we'll call you Pops too.
Well, maybe not pops, but something
or Peepaw, or
something along those lines. Yeah.
it'll be
Having
fun.
4 kids of my own, I'm sure one of them will have at least one. We'll see. We'll see.
That's right.
So how was it being an only child?
It had its same as siblings, I guess. It had its good parts to it. I got a lot of attention. Some would say too much attention, and so you can focus on a child's development in ways that maybe you can't with multiple children. And at the same time, I think there were aspects of it that made it really difficult, and things things that my wife would now tell you. She's definitely an only child because she doesn't share well. She doesn't share space well.
Right.
And that's an adjustment, that I think you do begin learning from siblings that I didn't get. And you don't realize that you didn't get that. You don't realize how selfish you really are when it comes to sharing and just expecting things to kind of be your way. So that's been a bit of a learning curve since I got married. But growing up, I missed having a sibling because most of my friends did have siblings. But I had this dog named Fritz, and when he would play with me, that was fun. But
Right.
it didn't take the place of a sibling. I had 3 cousins, boys, that I was very, very close to growing up, and I call them my brothers to this day. They're old middle-aged men now, like me, middle-aged woman, but we're still close, and I really appreciate having had them as kids.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So when you went off to college, where did you go to college?
I went to Abilene Christian University
Okay.
in remote, far off West Texas, full of cactus, and the land gets even flatter as you go farther west. But Abilene was a good place, and my experience at ACU was wonderful. My mother had gone to school there, so it was her alma mater. It's my alma mater. I got to go back and teach there a little bit later on, so holds a lot of good memories for me.
Yeah.
Now, you went to Baylor, is that right?
I did, yeah.
How was that for you?
It was an interesting experience for me. I was the first one on either side of the family to attend a major university and graduate. So it was a very daunting experience, if you will, for all of us, from financial aid to working 2 jobs full time while going to school, like all of that, right?
Yeah.
So I originally went to Baylor. I chose Baylor because I wanted to be a doctor.
Yeah.
So they had a great med school in Houston. So I applied to Baylor and got in, and 3.5 years into pre-med classes, organic chemistry.
Oh, yeah.
Changed the trajectory that I was on. So,
Yeah.
and I'm thankful. At the time when something happens to you, or that maybe you think is outside of your control, such as that test that I took that kind of Yeah. No matter how much, studying and tutoring and whatever else I did,
Yeah.
I bombed that test. And, but when you're going through something like that, you feel like you don't understand, like
Yeah.
why did I go through all this, and now this is happening, and what am I going to do now? And we all are in control of the way we react to things, right? And the
Sure.
choices that we make after the fact.
Sure.
And I chose not to move forward
Mm.
with that trajectory of going on to med school. And I'm looking back on it, I'm very thankful that I did make that choice,
Yeah.
right? But at the time, I didn't understand.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah.
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 And I think
it-
that happens in all sorts of walks of life, not
Oh,
just,
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. We're not taught this when we're that age and we get that grade on that test. But rather than that being a failure of some sort, it's simply an opportunity for us to see a gifting in a different area.
Mhm.
And you have such phenomenal gifts in other areas. I'd go to you as my doctor too, whether you failed organic chemistry or not. I would put stock in what you said,
Right.
but we don't see that as kids, and we can get stuck in thinking that this dream we've had has just collapsed, rather than it being a new path opening up to something that God may have gifted us to do even more.
Yeah. No, and I appreciate you saying that, because there are some dreams that people have that they continue to try to make come true and
Yeah.
try to make happen and force it, and it isn't what God's intent was.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
I have some examples that we may talk about later on in the show, but yeah, so
Yeah.
It's life is interesting.
It truly is.
Yeah. And so as far as, growing up, going to ACU, so, and I just have to say, she said she grew up in the 60s and 70s, and I think that's very evident in your outfit, the blouse you're wearing today. So,
yes.
yeah,
my
very, very
my shirt
colorful.
straight from the Laugh-In era.
Right.
Sock it to me.
Oh, that's great. Just had to throw that in real quick. So when you went to ACU, did you room with somebody? Or
I did.
Okay, so being an only child and not knowing how to share and all, like you described it
Oh.
earlier, like what was that relationship like of going to college?
Bless those girls' hearts.
Mm.
Bless their hearts for what they put up with from me. Oh goodness, yeah. I took potluck my freshman year, and that dear girl put up with a lot from me.
Mm.
It's just hard moving in. It was especially. I'll cut myself some slack. My grandmother passed away. Goodness, that was September 1st, so tomorrow,
Mm-hmm.
in 1979, and that was our first day of classes. So it was a hard first semester. It was a hard transition. And I did a lot of talking to God in those days and in making that transition. And so I was probably a horrible roommate to have to contend with. But I had wonderful friends, ended up making dear friends there that I keep in touch with to this day, and not just on social media, but in real life. And that's been really sweet. But yeah. I didn't know how to be a good roommate or a good housemate. I remember my senior year, I moved into a house of girls. There were apartments on campus, the shared apartments, and they were these hideous things that were 2-story and 1-story, and they had sliding glass doors, which was just horrible to put a bunch of college girls in, and they've since moved everybody away from those. But everybody decided that we would have one night a week where we cooked. And so there were 4 of us, 4 nights, Monday through Thursday. We would take turns cooking and be responsible for the meal. I remember the first 2 months, I was conning my friends into fixing a meal that I could bring in, because I was terrible. I knew nothing about kitchen. I knew nothing about preparing meal. My mom had been a home ec major, but it just did not transfer to me.
Right.
And so I would con my friends into fixing a casserole, and I would sneak it in the oven. And those poor girls didn't know that I wasn't
they
pulling
didn't.
my load for, either that or they just kind of let it slide.
The food was too good to,
Yeah.
to mess it up. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great. Yeah, my experience with my freshman roommate was far from, I guess, nothing's perfect, but you move to a space, and I did potluck as well,
Mhm.
and didn't know who I was rooming with, and got paired up with this guy from El Paso, and it was my eyes were opened. I had lived in a bubble, right, here in Garland, and went to a church where there was no drinking, no dancing, no cursing, no everything, right, and this roommate was just the opposite of that.
Oh, wow.
Right. So I was introduced to beer the first time, there, and alcohol poisoning once. I had to call the ambulance, and
Oh, my.
so it was an interesting
Yeah.
interesting freshman year.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I remember being homesick and calling home and going, "Mom, I don't know that I can
Oh,
stay
yeah.
here anymore.
oh,
I want
yeah.
to come home."
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So, well, so you said that after ACU, did you go immediately into teaching at ACU? Like, what was the time frame, and how did you come about that opportunity?
I had always thought that I would become a teacher. My mom had been a teacher. My dad did some teaching, and so that was going to kind of be a safety guard for me. I would get a teaching certificate, and I would always have that. Always have a way to provide for myself. But at the time, I wanted to go into some kind of public relations work. I used to tell people I wanted a job where I took people to lunch. And so I stuck around a little while longer, and I got a master's degree in communication, and I was a graduate assistant with the responsibility of teaching classes. I taught introductory speech courses,
Okay.
and I found that I just absolutely loved it. I
Mhm.
was teaching college freshmen for the most part, and just really enjoyed that. And so I thought, I'll, maybe at some point go back and work on a doctoral degree. But I'll stop and teach for a while. So I taught speech and debate. I coached forensics or competitive speech and debate for about 10 years at the high school level,
Mhm.
and loved that. Loved working with the kids. Those were my kids. They're all middle aged today, and I love keeping up with them on social media. I have had lunch with dinner with a few since I've moved to the Metroplex, and that's just been really sweet to have that kind of heritage with these old people that I taught in my classroom.
She
That's
just
really
called y'all
sweet.
old, by the way. Middle age is old in Sally's book. Okay, here we go. So when you had that experience, like, of teaching and the speech and debate, like, what memories do you have that stand out from that time period? Like, did you go to, I'm
How
sure
long
you
do
went to
we
competition. Right, well, we have plenty of time. No. So is there a major competition your
Oh,
students
yeah.
went to,
Yeah.
and y'all, like,
Yeah. Every year we went to state competition. There were two organizations: the University Interscholastic League (UIL) here in Texas, and then the Texas Forensic Association (TFA) was another even more prestigious organization, if you will, because in UIL you're competing against schools of a like size, and in TFA everybody competed. So I would take my kids from little Podunk, Abilene, Wiley,
Mhm.
and they would compete against 5 and what are 6A schools now here in Texas, or here in Dallas and in Houston. And the years that we took home state champions and the years that we had national qualifiers at the National Forensic League
Mhm.
tournaments. Those were exciting moments. But it was also exciting to see that kid who was scared bodily to death the
Mm.
first time they ever stood up,
Right.
and to just get them to say their names. You know, to have a kid who's been told, you can't do this, to have a kid identified more by the things that they couldn't do than the things that they could. And so they end up in sometimes what we call special ed or with special needs.
Mhm.
But to get that kid and to have them just get up and say their name in front of a room full of people
Mhm.
like they couldn't before,
Right.
that's every bit as meaningful to me as winning state, getting a state champion, getting a national qualifier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, as being a coach, a professor, in that space, do you see that? Do you critique? I'm just curious. Do you critique people when they're up speaking? And because I mean, I don't, and maybe the presidential debates, during political season, like,
Yeah.
is Sally sitting back going, "Oh, he shouldn't have said that," or "Oh, why?"
Well, first and foremost, we can critique Sally on a lot of things. I can't get
We
rid
can
of
all
this.
be critiqued. Yeah.
I can't get rid of this Texas drawl. It's too much a part of who I am, and lots of folks would tell you that I needed to. I would point them to somebody like an Ann Richards,
Mm.
though, and say, tell Ann Richards she's got to get rid of her Texas drawl. Yeah, I probably do that. I'm so grateful for the things I was taught. I mean, ACU professors taught me well in terms of how to present, how to communicate, with different groups of people, how to think about an audience, what to say and what not to say, and when to say it and when to just be silent. All those things are in that. But yeah, I mean, there are certainly some speakers that I enjoy listening to more than others. But I had a professor at ACU who said, he was teaching a preaching class at the time, and he said there's someone for every church out there. There's somebody who has a voice that is specially gifted to speak to that particular audience, that particular group of people. So it's not possible to say that, or at least to me, everybody has a voice with somebody.
It is also important to know your audience and to be
You
able to
bet.
read the crowd, right, that you're speaking to,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So how much of that does play into your like, have you ever given a speech or seen a speech delivered that they had to make some alterations based upon the
Oh, sure.
the room?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how hard is that?
Well, I think initially it requires a lot of forethought. You need to think. That's one of the first questions I ask when I go and speak to different
Mhm.
groups is who's going to be in that audience, who's that demographic. And depending on who it is, then does that mean that the essence of your message has to change? No. But the way in which you deliver it, the examples that you use, for instance, I mean, you don't talk to a classroom full of junior high students the same way you would talk to a classroom full of college students.
Sure.
Now, some might say it's not that different, but certainly that's going to change if you're going into a corporate clientele as opposed to a PTA group. You know, it might change slightly.
Yeah, yeah. And you did before, I mean, as we were prepping for today's show, you asked me sitting here, you're like, who's the audience?
Yeah.
Who am I speaking to today?
Yeah.
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 So, very good. All right, so you've been a professor now. How long were you a professor at ACU?
10 years. I took a little break after teaching high school for 10 years.
Okay.
I took a little break. I got it in my head that I wanted to go to law school. You know, I did this coaching debate thing and, you know, argumentation and persuasion. And I also felt very strongly about advocacy for different groups, for people who didn't have a voice necessarily. And of course, I'd read To Kill a Mockingbird, and who doesn't love Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird? And so I thought, as many people do who go to law school, I want to be Atticus Finch. And so I did the law school thing. I went to Texas Tech and got a law degree, passed the bar, and practiced law for a few years. But then I got a call from my favorite professor from ACU. And when your favorite professor calls, you can't turn him down.
Okay.
And I went back to Abilene Christian to coach their debate team. And I was there for 10 years.
10 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So you've done that. So what was next after being there at ACU?
Oh, my.
What was the next step?
Well, the next step, goodness, there's so much backstory to the next step, because if you had told me when I was in college, when I was teaching at the high school level, even when I was in law school, that at some point in my life I would want to form this nonprofit that helped churches and families resolve the conflict that we often feel between faith and sexuality, I would have I would have laughed in your face.
Sure.
Either that or just collapsed out of fear, because that grew out of my own experience and my own wrestling with my faith and my sexuality, to where in those days at ACU, when I was a college student in the early 1980s, having no clue really what was going on with me, but realizing that there was a growing attraction to girls that I didn't have any idea what to do with.
Right.
Had no idea where that came from. It was certainly not something that I chose. And in the 80s, you know, the ways that we had talked about sexuality in the 60s and 70s, I believed, like so many around me, it was the absolute worst possible thing that could happen.
Yeah.
And I couldn't understand. I was confused. I was afraid. And most of all, I was afraid to share that with anybody, because I had seen how we responded, especially in my Christian world. And for a 20-year-old young woman who took her faith very seriously, who was a devoted Christ follower, I couldn't imagine coming to terms with that. And there were no resources at all. So I just kept it a secret. I remember praying constantly for over a decade for God to remove those feelings, because I saw no other way for that to be okay. It just wasn't a possibility in my little Christian bubble that I was in. That was that was a very tumultuous time for me on the inside. Now, on the outside, all these other good things going on.
Right.
A wonderful life.
Mm-hmm.
But on the inside, I was wrestling in ways that nobody ever really knew.
And when you
I
say
certainly-
nobody, you mean nobody.
I mean, nobody.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, nobody but God.
Right.
Nobody but God. And I think that was the tragedy of it all, is that we had created a world in which it was not possible for me to remain a part of that world and not have it all just come crumbling down.
Mm.
Because I've thought about that a lot. I've thought, well, did you just not tell because you were afraid those things would?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, I had too many real life examples. I had friends whose families did turn away. I mean, not just kind of change the way they related. I mean, completely disappeared.
Right.
I mean, wrote letters and show up with that letter presented by the sheriff of the county to your front door saying, we as a family will have no more to do with you.
Mm.
When that's the response from a
Mhm.
Christian brother,
Yeah.
I was petrified to tell anybody lest that happened to me. And I didn't think that would be the response of my family, but I knew that my faith was number one to my family. And at that time, we taught people that unless this is gone, you can't be right with God. And we believed that. And sadly, some people still believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I know what a lie that is and what a harmful, devastating lie that is today, but I didn't know it when I was 20 years old.
Right. Right.
So I lived out of that lie for a lot of my life.
Yeah. And similarly, I can relate, right? So
I
it's,
know.
you feel like you're a hypocrite, right? You feel like
Yeah.
you're living this life and you have what I term as a mask,
Mhm.
right? You're hiding behind this mask and nobody can see behind the mask
Right,
because you don't allow them to,
right.
right? Because you are afraid of what, and a lot of times, if you've watched previous episodes, I have used the acronym of FEAR, FEAR, false evidence appearing real.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But in this instance, in my life and what I just heard from you and what you said, it wasn't false evidence appearing real. The fear was real,
Yes,
right? And it was because of the way, because I was raised in Church of Christ as well, right? And, as a child, you would hope that if you did say something to the closest people in your life, which are who? Your family, right? That they would still love you, they would still embrace you, and that they wouldn't kick you out. But I didn't know that.
Right.
I could not be assured of that. And I lived in fear too of if I was to say something, would I be out on the street the next day? Like, what would that even look like?
Yeah.
And even though grandma lived around the corner, would she let me sleep on her couch or in another room, or would she also close her door? So,
Yeah.
and I know, you say that was in the 80s?
Early 80s.
Early
yeah.
80s. I was going through that in the 80s and 90s as well, right? So, but it hasn't changed. Like, our society and our culture has changed some, Sally, right? But there are still kids out there that are still going through this today,
That's
right?
exactly right.
They still live in that fear.
Right.
And I experienced something this past weekend. I won't go into specifics, but I was in a room with people from my old church of growing up,
Oh, wow.
along with family,
Oh,
along
wow.
with my kids. And it was toxic. That's the word that I came up with from this weekend, right? Just the chatter that I saw happening because I was in the room.
Mm.
And just things that were said once I did leave. And it broke my heart because it wasn't so much about me. It was about the people in that room and how they made my mom feel. Like, that shouldn't happen.
No.
For a church. In what I wanted to stand up, Sally, and say, no wonder people don't share their most personal thoughts and feelings.
That's right.
For fear of judgment, for fear of ridicule, for fear of being ostracized, right? And they wonder why people aren't as real and authentic. There's a prime example of why that doesn't take place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry that happened.
And I appreciate that. It's just, and I even told, one of my siblings, I was like, I don't know if I want to go and expend that energy, knowing that what would probably happen, right? But after conversations and so forth, I made the decision to go, and I'm glad I did, because it's been 6.5 years of not having a real relationship with my mom, or my dad for that matter, but especially my mom. And I knew by being in the room with her that it may break down that wall that she has up a little bit more. Yeah. But I don't know that it did. I feel like that it may have been put up even more just because of the reaction of the other people in the room, which I just don't understand that. And I'm at a point in life too where I'm not trying to understand why people think the way they think, why they react the way they react. I can only control me. Yeah. Right? I can only control the way I present myself and live my life in a Christ-like manner, right? And not be dependent on how other people live theirs. Yeah. So I hope that message speaks to some of you out there, because that was one of the reasons I wanted to bring Sally on today, because we have a similar journey. And I am involved with Centerpiece, which is the nonprofit that she was speaking of earlier. And we do attend the same church. And so, and I'm at the church that I am and on the praise team and all that because of my introduction to Sally by one of my precious friends, Kathy Truitt. So all that being said, I love you so much. And I know you know that. And I know thank you. And I know we have a similar passion to help people, not only those that are experiencing what we experienced growing up as kids, right? But also to let the parents know. Exactly. Like, this is the impact that you're having on your children. Right. Right? So let's talk about that a little bit. What is that impact, Sally, that a parent's reaction, even if they don't kick them out, they're still maybe living in the house. Like, what is that impact?
Oh,
on
goodness.
That child?
We could spend an entire
Let's spend
podcast talking about parents, and yet we have come in contact through the ministry of Centerpiece with absolutely amazing moms and dads, parents who are trying so hard to be that loving, supportive, willing to learn, willing to stay in the conversation and engage.
Which is vitally important.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Voices in the lives of our LGBTQ plus siblings. And yet, parents have their own journey. It's said that parents are often closeted in their own ways too. they're in a different closet, and just like you said, how must your mom feel in this room full of other church folk, and the truth being that so many of us have grown up in Christian homes. It was Andrew Marin who identified in his doctoral research in the book Us versus Us back in 2014, so nearly a decade old. But at that time, the LGBTQ population that had grown up in church was 86%. 86% of us have grown up in church. And so our parents are in those churches, and most likely we're not talking Easter and Christmas Christians. We're talking Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night Christians like our families were.
Vacation Bible school,
Exactly,
knocking
exactly.
on doors. Yeah.
Whatever needed to be done, our moms and dads were doing it. And so these are the stalwart backbone workers of the church. That's all that you and I ever knew growing up.
Right.
And yet, when we come out, it's as though they are in a closet now, because if they share with someone at their church, there's this expectation that you then turn from your child, because this is clearly something we've got to get rid of. And so the way to do that is to not have any more. And yet, you know, I know, and I could quote you the passages that we have derived that mentality from, and yet I think there's so much more to how we have wrongly, if you will, interpreted, to take a story from 1 Corinthians 5 about expelling the immoral brother, and to then lay that on top of mamas and daddies who create lives and give birth to children and raise them, who raise them in the nurture and admonition of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And then you call them to turn their backs?
Mm-hmm.
How did we compare those apples and oranges and make this an all-time fix for how parents are to respond to a child, thinking that to turn someone away, to isolate and shun, would be the way to get anybody to stay connected to you, let alone turn from whatever it is you think they don't need to be doing.
Yeah, yeah.
How did we get there?
Well, and another story is the parable of the prodigal son that
Exactly.
is used over and which isn't
And that's
even...
that's the only example of how a parent should respond to a child.
Mm-hmm.
And that last part of the story, but while he was a long way off, Luke tells us, while he was a long way off, the father ran to him. That's the response.
Yeah, yeah.
We don't know what the prodigal was going to say.
Mm-mm.
He got his story together. Maybe he was, we don't know. But the father ran to him.
Yeah. With open arms and gave him a hug. Yeah.
So even for these folks who are at a place that you think that being gay is wrong, the response should never be to turn away from a child.
Right.
And like you said earlier, if you think that has stopped in this day and time in 2022, you need to think again.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's given me the opportunity, Sally, to I think be a better father to my children. Right? Because they see the non-interaction between my parents and myself.
Oh yeah,
right.
That hurts them
and
too.
It hurts them too, right? And they see that the holidays and the birthday
Yes.
parties that I'm not invited to, and
Yes.
and you know, and all that goes into that, it has given me the opportunity to let them know that there is nothing in this world that they could do or say that would ever keep them away from my table or outside of my door. Like, I'm going to love them unconditionally because they are my child.
Yeah.
And I believe that's the same love that God has for us too. It's an unconditional love.
Exactly.
Right? So anyway, I could go on and on and on with all that. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to part 1 with our interview with Sally Gary. Tune in next week for part 2. You don't want to miss it.
The Matt Hilton Show would like to thank our sponsors, Hilton Realty Advisors, and Maria Leach with the First United Mortgage Group. The Matt Hilton Show would also like to thank our partners, the Who Do You Know organization. You can find out more at wdyk.org. If you'd like to contact Matt or know a fascinating person with an inspiring story that would make a great guest, reach out to the show at themattHiltonshow@gmail.com.